I never liked Sophie, and honestly, I can't hide it anymore. From the moment she entered our lives, it felt like an ominous shadow had settled over us. You know that unsettling feeling you get when someone just doesn't sit right with you? Well, that was Sophie for me. She was loud, obnoxious, and had this uncanny ability to drain the energy from any room with her dramatic antics. But my wife, Rachel, was completely oblivious to all of this. To her, Sophie was the life of the party, spontaneous and like a breath of fresh air. I, on the other hand, saw her as nothing but trouble, clear as day. Right from the beginning, I could sense the cracks starting to show. Sophie was no ordinary friend. She was the kind of person who made everything revolve around her, constantly boasting about her escapades in the bedroom. Seriously, who does that? We could be enjoying a nice dinner when she would nonchalantly share stories of her latest conquests, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Oh, you know the guy from the gym? We hooked up in the locker room. He couldn't keep his hands off me. Really? Who talks like that? The worst part was how Rachel soaked it all up, giggling and egging Sophie on like she was living through her vicariously. I'll never forget the first real red flag. One night, Sophie convinced Rachel to hit up a nightclub. Now, Rachel was never one for that scene. We were more of a Netflix and wine kind of couple, you know? Yet there was Sophie, dragging Rachel off to these sleazy places as if they were college girls again. I told Rachel outright that I wasn't comfortable with it, warning her she could end up in a bad situation. But of course, she brushed me off. It's just one night. I need this, she insisted. Well, that so-called one night ended with Rachel stumbling through the door at 3 a.m., completely wasted and barely able to keep herself upright. She reeked of alcohol and poor choices. I had to help her to bed, where she crashed, still in her heels. I stood there, staring at her and wondering what the hell was happening to my wife. It took her 2 full days to recover, and Sophie? That bitch didn't even bother to check in. She vanished like she always did when things went south. That's when I felt the anger start to bubble up inside me. It wasn't just about that night. It was about the pattern I was witnessing. Every time Sophie was around, Rachel changed. She started distancing herself from me, little by little. They were always off doing something without me, making me feel invisible. And then there was the issue with money. I swear, Sophie had zero shame. She was always scheming, looking for some new investment to chase. One time, she managed to persuade Rachel to lend her a couple of $1,000s for some ridiculous business idea that went absolutely nowhere. And of course, I found out about it after the fact. Rachel didn't even ask me. She just went ahead and did it. When I confronted her about it, she shrugged and said, "It's my money. I can do what I want with it." Sure, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Sophie had her claws so deep in Rachel that she could manipulate her like a puppet. I could see it clear as day. And guess what? That money? Surprise, surprise, it was never repaid. Just gone. At this point, I was trying my best not to get involved. I told myself I couldn't control who Rachel was friends with, even though I knew Sophie was toxic. But things started to spiral quickly when Sophie got herself a new boyfriend. Suddenly, she had a new personality and couldn't stop gushing about how amazing he was in bed. I'd be sitting right there while she raved about his skills as if I was supposed to care. It was awkward, to say the least. And Rachel? She was eating it up, laughing along with Sophie and hanging on her every explicit detail. It didn't seem to bother her at all. At first, it didn't really bother me either. I figured it was just girl talk, right? But there was something in the way Rachel looked at Sophie, a sort of fascination, almost like she was mesmerized. That's when it hit me. Rachel wasn't just entertained by Sophie's stories. She was envious. She craved that excitement and thrill that Sophie seemed to be swimming in. That's when the shift really began. Rachel was always up for some new adventure with Sophie, staying out later and later with increasingly flimsy excuses. We just went for coffee after our workout. Yeah, right. Who goes for coffee at midnight? But I let it slide, convincing myself I was overthinking things. I kept telling myself it was just Sophie's influence, that Rachel would eventually snap out of it. But deep down, I knew something was off. Rachel was slipping away from me bit by bit, and I felt powerless to stop it. I hated Sophie for it. She was like a parasite, feeding off my wife's desire for excitement. And the worst part? Rachel couldn't even see it. She was completely blind to the damage Sophie was causing to her, to us, to our marriage. That's when suspicion started creeping in. The late nights, the secret phone calls, the way Rachel would go out of her way to defend Sophie whenever I raised concerns about how toxic she was. "She's just going through a rough patch," Rachel would insist. "She needs me right now. And what about me? What about our marriage?" I couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was more than just a bad influence. She was actively pulling Rachel away from me. And the worst part? I started to wonder if there was something more sinister going on. I didn't have any proof yet, but my gut was telling me this was more than just a friendship. Sophie was crossing boundaries, and Rachel was following her down a perilous path while I was left watching helplessly as my marriage slipped through my fingers. Over time, things began to change. It wasn't sudden, but little by little, the conversations between Rachel and Sophie shifted. Their conversations grew more personal and intimate in ways that felt downright inappropriate. It's hard to explain, but I started to feel like I was somehow part of their discussions, even though I wasn't included. You know how it is when you're in the next room, catching snippets of a conversation? That's how it began. Rachel and Sophie were always on the phone, but it wasn't the light chit-chat it used to be. The tone shifted to something secretive, as if they were sharing secrets that I wasn't meant to hear. Whenever Sophie came over, it became even worse. Her voice would echo throughout the house, filled with her absurd tales about her sex life. It seemed like every time she visited, she'd rave about how her boyfriend was the best she'd ever had, claiming their sex life was straight out of a movie. The way she described it made me uncomfortable, but Rachel would just laugh, treating it all like a big joke. Sophie kept insisting that every woman should experience pleasure like that at least once in her life. I remember hearing that and thinking, what on earth? Why was Rachel so entertained by this nonsense? Then things took a turn for the bizarre. One day, I was in the kitchen half listening as they chatted in the living room. Sophie was gushing about her incredible boyfriend again, and I could practically hear the smugness dripping from her voice like she was boasting about winning some award. Then I heard it, the comment that made my stomach drop. Sophie joked about how fun it might be to try something new and casually asked Rachel if she'd ever thought about having a threesome. I froze. I mean, that's not the sort of thing you expect to hear while chopping vegetables for dinner. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. Rachel laughed it off, but her laughter was awkward, as if she didn't quite know how to respond. Sophie, however, was relentless, teasing and making it sound like a casual, no big deal kind of suggestion. Just something fun to consider. I stood there, trying to process what I was hearing, praying it was all just a joke. In that moment, I kept telling myself it was nothing. I trusted Rachel. We had been through so much together, and I couldn't believe she would be interested in something like that. I figured it was just Sophie being her usual over-the-top self, testing the waters to see how far she could push. So I let it slide, convincing myself I was being paranoid. But after that, something about the whole situation started to irk me. You know that gut feeling I mentioned earlier? It came back with a vengeance. I tried to brush it off, but every time Sophie came around, I felt like an intruder in a conversation I wasn't supposed to know about. It wasn't just innocent girl talk anymore. Their discussions became too personal, too private. They talked about things they clearly didn't want me to hear, and it pissed me off. Rachel didn't mention any of this to me directly, of course. Why would she? She acted as if everything was perfectly normal, still cooking dinner, watching Netflix with me, engaging in small talk as if nothing had changed. But I could feel it. There was a noticeable shift. She started spending more time with Sophie, and those late nights became more frequent. Whenever I asked her where she was, the answer was always the same. We just grabbed coffee after the gym. Coffee at midnight? Really? Who buys that excuse? I wanted to confront her, but I didn't want to come across as the jealous, controlling husband. I was trying to be rational, trying to trust her. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more apparent it became that something was off. Those late nights weren't random anymore. They were becoming a routine. Every few days, Rachel would come home long after midnight, smelling like perfume and something else I couldn't quite identify, something that wasn't just coffee. There were moments I seriously considered following her, just to see where she was really going. But I stopped myself. What would that achieve? If she was lying to me, sneaking around wouldn't solve anything. I either had to confront her or let it go. Besides, I wanted to believe her. I didn't want to be the paranoid guy constantly suspecting his wife. I thought maybe this was just a rough patch. Perhaps I was overthinking it. But then there were the little things, like how she'd come home and immediately jump into the shower, or how she would dodge my questions when I asked about her night. If I tried to press for more information, she'd deflect or turn it into a joke. "Oh, you're not going to get jealous, are you?" she'd say with a smirk, treating it like it was all just a game. But this wasn't funny to me. One night, she came home later than usual. I was already in bed, half asleep, when I heard her tiptoeing into the room. She thought I was out cold, so she didn't even bother to be quiet. I opened my eyes just a crack and saw her in front of the mirror, taking off her clothes. That's when I noticed it, a small red mark on her neck. It definitely wasn't from a workout. I could tell you that much. My chest tightened, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I wanted to sit up, grab her by the shoulders, and demand answers, but I just lay there, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the hell was happening to my life. That was the first time I truly began to think that maybe it wasn't just in my head. Perhaps something was happening that I couldn't see, but could feel in every fiber of my being. I didn't have solid proof yet, but the signs were all there. Rachel was pulling away from me piece by piece, and Sophie was right in the middle of it all, stirring the pot of my thoughts. I kept telling myself to trust her, to have faith in our marriage. However, with every late night, every hushed exchange with Sophie, and every laugh that felt just a tad too forced, my trust began to erode. I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Sophie had transitioned from merely a bad influence to something much more dangerous. An instigator of chaos I wasn't prepared to confront, at least not yet. But deep down, I knew that soon I'd have no choice. Everything came crashing down one particular night. A night that has become etched in my memory, like a nightmare I can't escape. Rachel and I were sprawled on the couch in the living room, just a typical evening with the TV flickering in the background. Though honestly, I couldn't recall what we were watching. I was attempting to relax, desperately trying to suppress the suspicions that had been gnawing at me for weeks. We sat close, yet it felt as if an immense chasm separated us. I could sense her slowly withdrawing from me in subtle, unspoken ways, the furtive glances, the deliberate avoidance. It was as if she was physically present, but emotionally unreachable. Still, I insisted on ignoring those signs. Maybe I was just overthinking things, right? Then her phone buzzed. This was nothing new. Sophie was always lighting up her phone, so at first it didn't raise any alarms. But then Rachel let out a little chuckle, the kind that hints at a private joke. She started watching whatever video Sophie had sent her, angling her phone away just enough so I couldn't see. For reasons I couldn't articulate, my stomach knotted. Something in her reaction triggered the alarms in my head. That gut instinct I had been suppressing for months was now blaring, and I could no longer ignore it. I leaned over casually at first, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was amusing her. "What's so funny?" I asked, my voice steady, even as panic bubbled beneath the surface. Rachel didn't respond. She merely offered an awkward smile, far too focused on her phone. My heart raced. Something felt profoundly wrong. I leaned in again, this time more deliberately, and managed to catch a glimpse of the screen. Just a fleeting moment, but it was enough to freeze me in place. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The video was short and grainy, hastily filmed and lacking any care, but the images were unmistakable. There was Sophie, naturally, and right beside her was Rachel. My heart dropped. Then there was her boyfriend, all of them together in our bedroom. The realization hit me like a freight train. My hand moved instinctively, snatching the phone from her grasp. Rachel gasped in surprise, and the room plunged into a suffocating silence. The video continued playing in my hand, my eyes glued to the screen. Sophie was giggling, completely wasted, while Rachel and her boyfriend were. I could hardly process what I was witnessing. They were in our bed, my bed, the place where we shared everything, where we made love, where laughter echoed in our sanctuary. And now it lay desecrated. The world around me spun, my vision blurred, and my head throbbed. I felt the blood drain from my face as my hands trembled uncontrollably, yet I couldn't tear my gaze from the betrayal unfolding before me. Panic seized Rachel, and she scrambled to reclaim the phone from my grip, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Wait, it's not what it looks like. The bile rose in my throat. Not what it looks like. I practically growled, my voice low and laced with fury. That's you, Rachel, in our bed with them. The words felt like acid burning my tongue. She recoiled, her face drained of color as she realized I had witnessed everything. There was no escaping now, no more pretending. She reached for me, but I recoiled, rising so quickly that my chair nearly toppled over. I can explain, she pleaded, her voice trembling. We were drunk. Sophie. She pushed me into it. I didn't want to. It just happened. I stood there, staring at her, grappling with her words. But the betrayal slammed into me like a hammer blow. My chest tightened, and I could feel my heart racing in my ears. You didn't want to? I spat, rage boiling over. Then why the hell didn't you stop it? Why were you laughing about it just a moment ago? How long has this been going on? Tears glistened in her eyes as she fumbled through some pitiful excuse. It was just once. I swear it was only that one time. Sophie made it sound fun. We were drunk, and I wasn't thinking straight. But I was done listening. I couldn't bear to hear anything except the roar of blood rushing in my ears, drowning out the sound of my heart shattering into a million pieces. All those nights, all those conversations that fell off, the lies about coffee after the gym, it all clicked into place now, and the truth was worse than I could have ever imagined. She made you, I repeated, my voice barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. You're blaming Sophie for this? Sophie didn't force you to do anything. You did this, Rachel. You let this happen. By now, she was sobbing, trying to come closer, trying to touch me, but I stepped back, repulsed. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the person I had married. This was someone unrecognizable, someone who could shatter our lives for some cheap thrill. I'm sorry, she cried, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. Please, just please listen. But I was done listening. I felt hollow, emptied out. My anger had turned into cold, hard resolve. I had nothing left to say to her. I grabbed my jacket, my mind racing with the urgent need to escape, to get out of the house before I said or did something I'd regret. Go to hell, Rachel. I finally managed to say, my voice raspy. Just go to hell. With those words, I stepped out the door, leaving her there sobbing and begging for my forgiveness. But at that moment, it no longer mattered. Nothing she said could ever mend what she had shattered. As I slammed the door behind me, the stark realization hit me. The life we had built together, the trust, the love, the marriage, it was all over. She had obliterated it, and there was no turning back. Yet, this wasn't where the story ended. Oh no, not even close. Walking out of that house didn't extinguish the raging fire of fury inside me. As I drove aimlessly through the dark streets, my mind was a whirlwind, fueled by a volatile mix of betrayal and anger. I kept replaying the scene in my head, seeing Rachel, Sophie, and that smug jerk in my bed, over and over. My fist clenched the steering wheel so tightly that I feared I might snap it in two. Then a thought ignited in my mind. What had started as a flicker quickly morphed into an all-consuming plan. I wasn't just going to walk away from this. No way in hell would I let them get away unscathed. The first thing I did was pull over to transfer the video to my phone. At that point, I didn't even care about the legal ramifications. All I craved was for them to experience the same level of humiliation that I was drowning in. I needed that satisfaction. Once I had the video securely saved, I deleted the message from Rachel's chat history with Sophie, ensuring she wouldn't have a clue that I had taken it. That was step one. I sat there in the car for a few moments, staring at the screen as the heat simmered within me. My phone buzzed. Of course it was Rachel, trying to call, desperately attempting to apologize and find some way to fix the unfixable. The thought of her crying and begging for forgiveness turned my stomach. She could weep all she wanted. I was done listening to her excuses. I let the call go to voicemail, and that's when the real plan took shape. You see, Rachel had always been the golden child in her parents' eyes, the perfect daughter who could do no wrong. They idolized her. She could do anything and still be their little princess. Well, I was about to destroy that facade. I wanted them to see her for who she truly was. I needed them to understand the depths of her betrayal, to feel the same disgust that consumed me. I pulled up her parents' contact information on my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen for just a heartbeat. A tiny sliver of doubt tried to creep in, but then I hit send. I attached the video along with a short, brutal message. This is who your daughter really is. Nothing more. A few minutes later, I received a notification. Seen? I could only imagine the horror on their faces, the devastation of seeing their beloved daughter reduced to this. They didn't reply right away, which suited me just fine. I didn't need a response. The message was sent, and the damage was done. But that was just the beginning. I wasn't finished with Sophie either. She was the mastermind behind this entire mess, and I had no intention of letting her escape unscathed. Sophie had orchestrated this sick game, manipulating Rachel and dragging her into this chaos. And Sophie wasn't just some nobody. She had a reputation to uphold. At her workplace, she was the center of attention, the woman who always had it all together. People admired her, and she thrived on that admiration. But that wouldn't last much longer. That video would be my weapon, and I was ready to wield it. I didn't hesitate. I knew exactly what I had to do to ruin her career and her perfect little life. I edited the video carefully, making sure to cut out any parts that showed Rachel's face. This wasn't about protecting her. No, this was about hitting Sophie where it would hurt the most, her public image. I uploaded the video online, doing so anonymously, of course. I wasn't foolish. The entire world didn't need to know I was behind this. I shared it on a few shady forums, the kind where videos like this spread like wildfire. It didn't take long. Within hours, the video was everywhere, circulating and being shared. By the next day, it had gone viral. And Sophie? She couldn't hide from it. Her face was plastered all over the internet. Her name dragged through the mud. Her coworkers saw it. Hell, even her boss saw it. I heard through the grapevine that she initially tried to deny it, claiming it was fake, but the evidence was irrefutable. She was finished. Just a few days later, she was fired, and her once perfect reputation lay in tatters. Meanwhile, Rachel kept trying to mend things between us. I must have received 100 calls from her. Text after text. Voicemail after voicemail. Each one more pathetic than the last. She was desperate, expressing her regret, insisting it was a mistake. It didn't mean anything, she kept saying, but none of it mattered. My mind was made up. I wasn't going to forgive her. I couldn't. The betrayal ran too deep, too fresh. After what I had done, sending that video to her parents and ruining Sophie's life, I knew there was no turning back. Even if I wanted to, which I didn't. The bridge was burned. Rachel had no idea that her parents had already seen the video. I waited, knowing it was only a matter of time before they confronted her. And when they did, I could only imagine the fallout. I might not have been there to witness it firsthand, but I didn't need to be. I knew exactly how they would react. The disappointment, the shame, it would shatter them. And Rachel would bear the weight of it all. She'd lose the one thing that had always made her feel secure. The unwavering approval of her parents. That was the real justice for me. As the days passed, the satisfaction of my revenge settled in, like a fire that finally burned out after raging uncontrollably. I wasn't particularly proud of my actions, but I certainly felt no remorse. They deserved every ounce of this. Both Rachel and Sophie thought they could rip my life apart without facing any repercussions. They assumed I would just roll over and accept their betrayal. But I made sure they experienced every bit of the pain I had endured, and not for a single moment did I regret it. The divorce was shockingly quick. I suppose that's what happens when the evidence is so overwhelmingly damning that there's nothing left to argue about. Rachel didn't have a leg to stand on. Deep down, I think she knew that from the moment I caught her. The shock of being fully exposed left her with no fight. She didn't even attempt to contest anything. There were no drawn-out arguments, no dramatic courtroom theatrics, just a cold, swift ending to what had once seemed like an unbreakable marriage. It certainly didn't help that Rachel's world crumbled around her. The very parents who had always viewed her as their perfect little girl turned on her the moment they saw that video. I wasn't there to witness the fallout, but I heard it was absolutely brutal. I can only imagine the horror on their faces as they grasped what their daughter had been up to. They didn't speak to her for weeks. The weight of their disappointment was simply too much for them to bear. They severed ties almost immediately, showing me they weren't nearly as forgiving as Rachel had hoped. Then there were her friends, or rather her former friends. The scandal spread like wildfire, especially after Sophie's video went viral. Even though I had skillfully kept Rachel's face out of it, people began connecting the dots. You know how gossip works. It never stays buried for long. Whispers turned into rumors, and those rumors soon became undeniable truths. At first, Rachel tried to deny everything, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But it was futile. The shame clung to her like a second skin. It didn't take long for her to find herself isolated. Friends who once stood steadfastly by her side began to distance themselves, likely fearful that their own lives would be tainted by association. After all, who wants to be friends with someone embroiled in a public sex scandal? It was hard to watch, but honestly, I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. She had brought this upon herself. For me, the divorce process turned out to be surprisingly liberating. I had expected it to be painful, to feel some kind of loss or grief. But instead, I felt nothing, just an emptiness that enveloped me. The entire ordeal wrapped up within a couple of months. Merely a series of paperwork, signatures, and a few uncomfortable meetings with lawyers. In the end, I walked away with what I wanted: the house, my car, and the life I had constructed long before Rachel came into it. I was free. For the first time in a long while, I could finally breathe. When the day of the divorce arrived, I felt no urge to celebrate. It wasn't a victory. It was simply the conclusion of a chapter one never anticipated closing so soon. Yet, it was over, and that was enough for me. I was ready to move on, and that's when I met Claire. Claire was everything Rachel was not. I still remember the first time I saw her. She radiated confidence, the kind that fills a room effortlessly. She wasn't loud or flashy like Sophie, nor was she manipulative like Rachel. No, Claire was grounded, intelligent, and above all, ambitious. I think that was what attracted me most. She had her own life, her own aspirations, and she wasn't interested in dragging me into her issues. After everything I had endured, that was exactly what I needed. We crossed paths by chance through a mutual friend who coerced me into attending a social event I had no desire to go to. It's funny how life works like that. I was sitting there, half tuning out the small talk, when Claire sat down next to me and struck up a conversation. At first, I was guarded. After Rachel, I wasn't exactly eager to trust another woman so quickly. But Claire was different. She wasn't trying to force anything. She was simply being herself, authentic, unfiltered, and refreshingly honest. We began hanging out casually, without any pressure. But soon it developed into something deeper. I won't lie, I hesitated initially. I questioned whether I was ready for another relationship so soon after my divorce. Yet, Claire had a knack for making me feel like I could leave my past behind. She never pried into my personal life, never asked about Rachel or the scandal that had derailed everything. She didn't need to. She simply allowed me to be. For that, I was immensely grateful. The more time I spent with her, the more I realized how much of myself I had lost during my marriage. I had become so consumed with fixing things and making Rachel happy that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist. Claire brought me back to that. She reminded me what it was like to feel normal again, to laugh freely without the heavy cloud of betrayal hovering over me. With her, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to fix anything. I could just be myself. That's when I knew it was finally time to move on. I'll never forget the day I finally let go of the anger I had held onto for so long. It wasn't a grand epiphany or a dramatic moment. It was quiet, almost imperceptible. I was sitting in my new apartment, gazing at the city skyline. When it hit me, I didn't hate Rachel anymore. I didn't care about Sophie, the scandal, or any of it. It was all behind me, and I was done allowing it to control my life. Claire and I began building something new together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We were real. She challenged me in ways I hadn't experienced before, pushing me to focus on myself and my own happiness. Instead of endlessly trying to mend someone else's chaos, I stumbled upon something I thought had slipped from my grasp forever. Hope. Hope that, maybe, just maybe, I could carve out a future untainted by the betrayal I had suffered. I won't pretend that everything was a walk in the park. Healing is a messy, often painful process, and there are still moments when old wounds ache. But with Claire, I discovered how to stop looking back. I learned to let go of the bitterness, the anger, and the pain that had held me captive for so long. For the first time in ages, I felt as if I had a future worth anticipating. I had believed I was finished with Rachel after the divorce, that she had vanished from my life, relegated to a painful chapter of my past. But of course, reality had other plans. A few months after everything was finalized, she showed up at my door, looking like a shadow of her former self. I hadn't seen her since the last court date, and when I opened the door, it felt like a ghost had returned to haunt me. Her complexion was sallow, her eyes puffy and red from crying, and she stood there, looking utterly lost, as if she didn't know where to turn. For a fleeting moment, I felt nothing, no rage, no heartbreak. It was as if all those intense emotions had faded away. But then, seeing her so shattered brought back painful memories of what we once had and what we had lost together. I remained silent at first, just standing in the doorway, allowing her to gather her thoughts. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her gaze glued to the floor. "I'm so sorry." Tears flowed freely as she spoke. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut, to deny her entry just as she had once pushed me out of her life, swept away by Sophie's influence. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside, allowing her to come in. She settled onto the couch, the same couch where we had shared countless movie nights, where our laughter once filled the room with warmth. Looking up at me, her face streaked with tears, she started to speak, her words tumbling out in a chaotic rush of apologies and remorse. "I made a mistake," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I wasn't thinking. Sophie pushed me into it. But it's not her fault. I should have stopped it. I should have fought harder. I lost everything. I lost you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I lost our family. I watched her in silence, taking in the woman I had once loved, now sitting in fragments before me. Part of me felt a flicker of pity. I could see she was suffering, grappling with the fallout of her choices. Yet, the other part of me, the part that had moved on, felt nothing but icy detachment. She pleaded for another chance, insisting she would do anything to mend what had been shattered. "I miss you," she said, her voice breaking. "I miss us. I'd give anything to go back and undo my mistakes. I want us back," she whispered through her tears. I stayed calm, refusing to let the memories of our past stir any anger within me. The truth was, I had already released that burden. "I don't hold a grudge anymore," I replied, my voice steady. "But there's no going back, Rachel. That chapter of our lives is closed." Her eyes searched mine for any sign of hope, but I knew she could see the finality in my words. "I'm not angry," I continued. "I'm not even hurt anymore. But you and I are finished. We were done the moment you crossed that line with Sophie and that guy. You shattered what we had, and there's no repairing it." The silence that followed felt endless. Rachel nodded, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweater. "I get it," she said softly. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry." With a nod, I acknowledged her apology. And just like that, she stood up. There wasn't much left to say. We had both expressed what needed to be said. As she walked out the door, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. No sadness lingered, just closure. But that wasn't the end of it. Surprisingly, Rachel and I maintained a thread of contact. We exchanged the occasional text like distant acquaintances who once shared something profound. It felt awkward, yet it seemed like the mature path forward. There was no animosity, no lingering resentment, just an odd sense of moving on. I think we both held on to the hope that we could remain friends, that perhaps enough time had passed for us to interact without reopening old wounds. Then Claire entered the picture. Rachel hadn't met her yet, but she had heard about her. I wasn't actively seeking a new relationship, but news travels fast. One day, While out with Claire at a quaint cafe we loved, I spotted Rachel walk in. The moment she laid eyes on us, her expression shifted dramatically. It was as if she had been dealt a physical blow. Her gaze immediately zeroed in on Claire before shifting back to me. The jealousy was palpable, clear as day, a look I hadn't seen in years. For a brief moment, I felt a twinge of sympathy for her, but it passed quickly. Claire, blissfully unaware, continued our conversation, while I watched Rachel stand frozen, processing the scene before her. Within seconds, she turned on her heel and left. Later that day, I received a brief text from Rachel. "I saw you today. She's beautiful. I'm glad you're happy." I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. After that, Rachel stopped reaching out altogether. She ceased texting and calling, effectively withdrawing from my life. I suppose seeing me with Claire was the final straw, a stark reminder that I had truly moved on and that any hope for reconciliation was dashed. Claire was everything Rachel was not: confident, intelligent, kind, and above all honest. She was secure in herself and didn't need to play games or seek validation from anyone else. Being with Claire felt like I had finally found solid ground again, as if the chaotic tremors of my past had settled. Rachel lost me forever that day, and I think she finally comprehended the depth of that loss. Whatever hope she had been clinging to evaporated in that moment. She could apologize endlessly, but the truth was that I had a new life now, a brighter life, one that didn't include her. I didn't harbor hate for Rachel anymore. I didn't even feel pity for her. I simply felt nothing. She made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. As for me, I was finally free, embracing a future that didn't involve looking back. The past was firmly behind me, and I had moved on. She was no longer part of my narrative,